Suggested earlier that 165 million constitutes a hangnail compared to the bigger problems facing us and our economy. Speaking to Jay Leno last night, the president seemed to acknowledge that, yes, the hangnail must be removed, but also that it must not distract from that larger mission of making the systemic change needed to reestablish a sound, secure American economy.
We're going to do everything we can to see if we can get these bonuses back. But I think the most important thing that we can do is make sure that we put in a bunch of financial, regulatory mechanisms to prevent companies like an AIG holding the rest of us hostage. Because that's the real problem. The problem is not just what's happened over the last 6 months. The problem is what was happening for years, where people were able to take huge excessive risks with other people's money, putting the entire financial system at risk, and there were no checks. There were no balances. There was nobody overseeing the process. Here's the dirty little secret, though. Most of the stuff that got us into trouble was perfectly legal. And that is a sign of how much we've got to change our laws.
Mr. Obama's remarks coming after former Bush Deputy Press Secretary Tony Fratto, as a new contributor to CNBC, warned Congress to not use regulation to punish Wall Street. And after Minority Leader Boehner claimed that Wall Street had never been deregulated, in so doing suggesting even the few Republicans still left in power are rewriting the history books in preparation for opposing new re-regulation, despite the fact that even remaining Bush appointees like the Fed Chair Ben Bernanke are now publicly calling for exactly that, re-regulation, all while Congress remains focused on crafting legislation to get back 90% of $165 million, rather than properly regulate $1 trillion in bailout money or drag the multi-trillion-dollar shadow market back into the light for good. Let's bring in MSNBC political analyst Richard Wolff. Thanks for your time tonight, Richard.
My pleasure, Keith.
If Obama says the most important thing is regulation, why have we not in turn seen a push for regulation parallel to the rush to the bailout and the rush to the stimulus package?
Well, the administration is trying to have this push for regulation, but you're not going to get the A1 lead on the New York Times starting with the words the president just used, financial regulatory mechanisms. It's not sexy. People don't think there are votes in it. But what they're talking about is an incredibly fundamental reworking of the relationship between business and government. It really is as big as the first time this debate came up in recent memory, which is with Ronald Reagan, who rolled back regulation. You know, a number of times through the campaign, then candidate Obama compared himself to Reagan, wanting to have the opposite effect, but as big effect on the culture as he did. And I think what you're seeing here is a rolling back. You know, what Reagan did was to undo many of the things that have been done from the 30s and 40s and 50s. When it comes down to regulation, the things that were set up in that period in the 30s are some of the big institutions in Washington, like the Federal Trade Commission. That's what he's leading up to. But I don't think people are paying attention.
So to that point, have the President and the Treasury Secretary screwed this up to some degree only by dint of having to spend time, spend political capital on a deeply symbolic, obviously angering, but in the big picture, relatively trivial issue of these Wall Street bonuses?
There have been many screw-ups, and actually I think the big screw-ups have come from the Federal Reserve, which knew most about the AIG situation much more and much earlier than even Treasury and certainly the White House. But if they were smart about this inside the White House, they would have positioned themselves leading up to this bonus story to say this is exactly why we need to move ahead with the agenda on regulatory issues. But in fact, they were blindsided. Their radar wasn't working right, or folks in the Fed just didn't tell them. So it's more of a screw-up than anything by design.
But is there also a positive sign to it? Because perhaps the president doesn't mind this dust-up over AIG and this very easy-to-understand part of it, because it creates this public outrage, this, you know, crude populism, and he can challenge that crude populism into public support for restoring regulations. If you say, here's the problem you're angry about, the solution are more regulations, you make regulations suddenly obviously connected to something as easy to understand as AIG.
Well, we've certainly arrived at that point. This week is sort of pre-Leno and post-Leno. And I think post-Leno, yes, you can see how the president has led up to this point. But I think it's been a hit-and-miss affair. And if you think about the start of the week, where you had Larry Summers going out there, you know, saying, thou shalt not abrogate contracts willy-nilly. I mean, you know, this wasn't by design. But they have got there in the end. The question is, you know, you've got to sustain this. This is a deeply complex thing. Every financial lobbyist in town, and yes, there are still many of them, will be on top of this this one, it can be dragged out and weakened. They really have to sustain it to make it worthwhile.
And are there signs, in fact, yet whether the stimulus money is starting to stabilize the economy to staunch the losses? And if it has, does that actually hurt Obama because it might remove some of the urgency in this issue?
Yeah, I think the days of sort of rushing things through are pretty much over. You've got a Congress and a political sort of body which is just too resistant to this stuff. And in terms of whether he can proceed, you know, it's going to have to be just by force of the argument here. You cannot rush regulatory stuff. It just has to be done slowly.
Richard Wolff of MSNBC, as always, thanks and have a great weekend.
And you, Keith.